Welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is our second Romancelandia University lecture series. We have Shavi, also known as Purely Romantic, in our Bookstagram community, here to talk with us today about her area of study. And this is so exciting for us, and we cannot wait to learn more from Shavi because I think this will be so valuable to all of us who regularly read historical romance, especially for those of us reading a lot of historical romance that is either set in England or is directly related to the things British folks were doing around the world. So Shavi has been a romance reader for more than 15 years. She, like many of the hardcore old-time historical readers we have talked to recently, started with Whitney, my love, which just continues to amaze me. And that set off a love for the subgenre. And she currently resides in Sri Lanka and is working on her PhD in English literature, examining the role of late 18th and early 19th century drama in Britain's imperial interests in South Asia. So she is going to share a little bit more about empire and race in historical romance. And I will go ahead and kick it over to Shavi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to Kelsey and Emily so much for inviting me to do this. I am probably a little too excited to talk about this because it's more often than not people like, okay, you've talked enough about empire and race. So I am very happy to be doing this today. And like the good academic I am, I have a presentation. It's the first time I did this in Canva, so that's very exciting for me. But yeah, and just to kind of kick things off, I am going to be largely talking about Britain's interests, although in some of the books that Kelsey and I talked about, there's a few things about the US over there, but my research primarily looks at Britain and Britain's work, or work is an interesting way to put it, but Britain's presence in South Asia. So while I am going to be talking a little bit about Britain's presence in the African continent, that will be a little bit more general, just as an FYI. Okay. So I kind of wanted to start off with this particular portrait of George Gordon, Lord Byron, one of the Romantic poets who was very active during the Regency period. And I haven't seen this lately, but there was a time when Byron would pop up like a cameo in some of our historical romances. He'd be at a ball and someone would notice him in a corner and then yank their young daughter away from him or something like that. And this is why I picked this portrait for two reasons. One is that the the typical sort of alpha male historical romance hero that we all love, our brooding dukes and our earls with secrets and, all that kind of that character is in many ways sort of a portrayal of a Byronic hero, which is the term that's given to the type of rebellious, brooding, very masculine hero that maybe has some sort of mysterious past that was popularized by Byron in his poetry and was also kind of, said to be a mirror of his own personality. As I said, he was a nobleman. He was an aristocrat. He had prolific affairs with both men and women. He apparently had a menagerie of exotic animals. He was known as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And so this feels very sort of Histrom-ish. And in this particular portrait, he's wearing Albanian clothes. And Albania was part of the Ottoman Empire during the 19th century and would have been considered part of the East or the Orient. Um, the fact that he acquired this set of clothes, sat for a portrait that there were many versions of, and it was displayed kind of all over London at the time, really kind of sums up the notion of Orientalism, which came into being during this early part of the 19th century, or in the time period that comprised of the Regency. Now, Byron loved the East. He was in and out of the Mediterranean his whole life. He championed Greek causes, fought for Greek independence, and eventually even died in Greece. But then his poetry, largely, and his written work displayed this kind of fascination or even a fixation with the East. And it was full of this sort of exotic imagery of the mysterious East, beautiful, often Arab women. angry, despotic sultans, all these kinds of stereotypes that we now recognize as ways of objectifying and exoticizing the East. And there has been a lot of scholarly ink that has been spilled over whether these representations in his poetry can be considered problematic or not. I'm not going to get into that today. We don't have the time in the world for that. But this image, I think, really symbolizes the complexity of both the kind of dual fascination and anxiety that British citizens displayed in regards to the East and the kind of ever-growing empire of the 18th and 19th century. And so I keep using the word Orientalism. So for anyone who may not know what that is, it was a term that was, and a concept that was coined by Palestinian American academic Edward Said, that attempts to frame and explain the way the East was conceptualized by the West. This is sort of basic reading for kind of any student of history or empire, and certainly for post-colonial studies. And I'll read this quote from the beginning of the book since it sums up his theory really well. Orientalism is a way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based on the Orient's, oh, hang on, I can't see because of the, there we go. With the Orient that is based on the Orient's special place in European Western experience. The Orient is not only adjacent to Europe, it is also the place of Europe's greatest and richest and oldest colonies, the source of its civilization and languages, its cultural contestant, and one of its deepest and most recurring images of the other. In addition, the Orient has helped to define Europe, or the West, as its contrasting image, idea, personality, experience. The Orient is an integral part of European material civilization and culture. Orientalism expresses and represents that part culturally and even ideologically as a mode of discourse with supporting institutions, vocabulary, scholarship, imagery, doctrines, even colonial bureaucracies and colonial styles. And the book, again, is called Orientalism. I actually highly recommend it, even though it is technically an academic book, because Edward Said's writing is very, very easy to read. And it's particularly pertinent right now with everything going on in the world. And I kind of particularly want to draw our attention to this phrase, like the recurring images of the other, because it emphasizes a way of looking, a framework of perception, if you will, that always defined the East by Western standards. Or to kind of put it more bluntly, a framework that consistently places the West as morally, culturally, and politically superior to the East. And while the Orient historically refers to what we recognize today as North Africa and the Middle East and Asia, it also extends to the entirety of the global South's treatment by the Western world today, even though Said was really mostly talking about the Middle East in his book. And as a sort of visual, a visual representation of that is this painting, which is, there's two names for it. Sometimes it's referred to as the East offering its riches to Britannia. Other times it's called Britannia receiving the riches of the East, depending on where you look. This image was commissioned to be on the roof of one of the rooms of the East India Company House in London during the 18th and 19th centuries. That building no longer exists, but this was on the roof of one of the buildings. And it's kind of like one of those dome kind of roofs, if the closest thing I can think of for some reason is the Capitol building in the US. So one of those kinds of, this massive thing that you could look up and see. And I am fascinated by this image. If you look at this figure over here, can you see me using the pointer on this? Okay, that's Britannia, white as marble, sitting on a rock, and I will, note the particular positionality of Britannia because she is, literally looking down on the other figures. And you have Calcutta over here, visibly darker, bare-bodied, holding up this tray of jewels and riches. Over here, this is meant to represent China with the porcelain vase. And over here, this is Persia. And according to the documents that talk about this painting, this is meant to be Mercury, who they've described as the god of merchandise. And then at the back over here is the ship, which is meant to represent the East India Company and its sort of voyages into India and other locations. There's a lot more I could say about this, but what I do want to say is that this was, I think, an interesting move. This was commissioned in the 1770s, and then it really shows how the East India Company at this time was really trying to cement itself as a sort of official company. It was always official, but it worked in the background. They were doing their thing, trading, getting stuff, conquering places. But now it is turning to things like visual symbols and pieces of art to kind of make a statement about who they are. And I think that's really interesting. So let's move on to actual historical romances. I This is just a list off the top of my head that I think signal the presence of empire either implicitly or explicitly. And these are just symbols, items, instances, plot points that we sort of see scattered across historical romances that we read. Um, I don't think I need to go into too much explanation about some of these, but obviously, sugar, tea, coffee, chocolate, and rum were grown in plantations across South Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean with enslaved Africans or indentured servants after abolition. And I recently was made aware of the sugar bowl, this image over here, which I cannot find exactly where it is displayed at the moment, but it is, I believe, in a museum either in London or in Philadelphia. I have to look that up. But it is literally showing an African woman by the sugar bowl, and it's sort of making no attempt to hide how the sugar was acquired. And this is the sort of sugar container that would have been on anybody's tea tray. So whenever you're reading about folks having tea and having conversations in our novels, that sugar has a history, that tea has a history, that coffee has a history that doesn't really get explicitly talked about, but it's there. The same with the kind of silks and silk shawls or muslin dresses or cotton that they were using. Anytime someone's gifted a beautiful necklace as a grand gesture, where did those gems come from? Where did those pearls come from? My own country, Sri Lanka, was famous for the pearls and the gemstones. If you see any place referred to as Ceylon, they're talking about Sri Lanka there. Perfumes that were brought from various Arab countries or from the Silk Route. We often see opium as a plot point in our books, someone giving into opium addiction, needing to be heroically rescued from that. That is a result of the East India Company's moving into East Asia. And then I also want to talk about things like street performers. We come across Vauxhall Gardens all the time. The place of shenanigans, things that happen in the shadows. And often what we don't really see, or maybe is not mentioned often, is this was a place that would have been considered a place of illegitimate theater, by which all that it meant was it was performances that didn't involve actual speaking. So it was not something in Drury Lane or Covent Garden. These were little bits of performances that were like people like jugglers or acrobats or snake charmers. So, people like that. And a lot of those folks would have been from places like India. Um, and even in the theaters themselves, there were a handful of Black and brown performers. Ira Aldridge is a really good example of this. He was a African American Black actor who ironically found getting into theater and plays and playwriting in the US too racist. And so he came over to England and had better success there. He was quite well known, both in both the UK and in the US. There are records of elephants being on stage. I had no idea how they accomplished that. Anytime there was an animal on stage, it usually ended in absolute chaos. But there are some playbills that I found more in the late 19th century where elephants were brought on stage. And then, of course, there were numerous plays that talked about various historical events in India. Sometimes they would take actual battles or moments where, like famous moments where British soldiers were killed or things like that, and dramatize them on the stage for various political agendas. we come across travelogues a lot in our reading. Kelsey and I were just reading A Modest Independence, where Jenny talks a ton about the travelogue that she is referring to and using as a guide as she travels through Egypt and India. And so these were, in any time people went to the East, they could come and publish a travelogue. But then there were also private correspondences that people who had family members working in the East India Company would write to their loved ones, and those also worked as a travelogue of a certain kind. If any time any of your characters go to a museum, they're probably looking at artifacts that were either gifted to them by nobility in those countries or stolen as kind of war prizes. If I had time, I would show some really ridiculous things that are now, you know, housed in the British Museum or the Victoria and Albert Museum. And these are items that countries that were formerly colonies are still fighting to get back to our countries. And then the other thing that we don't really talk about a lot, or we are talking about it now a little bit, is that our historical romance is primarily focused on the aristocracy. And that wealth is amassed usually at the expense of slave labor, theft, and resource mining. A piece of scholarship that was done a while back estimates that the amount of money, if we try to put a monetary value to what was stolen from India, it would amount to about $45 trillion today. Um, I am not a math person. I have not kind of crunched the numbers, but this is what the scholarship says. And then conversely, also the invisible people that we don't see in our books, sometimes the servants, the footmen, people working in working classes by the harbors, these were likely frequently Black and brown people from various parts of the world who had come to England, either because they were travelers and they just decided to settle there, or they accompanied British families and then were forced to stay there or decided to stay there on their own. Or people who were brought as performers, like those jugglers, etc., and then couldn't find a way to go back. There's lots of different ways in which people could arrive in London, but suffice it to say, London was a brimming cosmopolitan city that where there was no shortage of seeing people from all kinds of countries with all kinds of ethnicities and from all kinds of racial backgrounds. Um, oops. Where do I go back? 1 second. And then before we go on to talking about the book specifically, I just a few takeaways that I think, you know, I'm throwing a lot of information at everybody, but a few of the takeaways that I think are important and that don't get kind of the nuance gets lost a little bit when we're talking about the empire and how it surfaces in historical romances is I think what I would like people to know too is that the East India Company and the British Raj were kind of two different functions of the British Empire. And I think that's really important. The distinction is important. And so if we're talking about 18th century romances, that was largely a time when it was either the Royal African Company that was working, which was largely what facilitated the transatlantic slave trade, or the East India Company, which was, you know, truly a corporation. You know, it's sort of like if, you know, Google decided to kind of venture out into different parts of the world, or oil companies. I mean, honestly, it's still happening. And what's really important to know too is that, I mean, these were private charters that were granted by the crown to these, companies that then went out to do trade and then slowly started taking over various regions and kingdoms and tribal areas. I'm speaking of India, but it happened the same way in a lot of other places. And that sort of started to become a threat to British sovereignty, because what does it say about your authority if a private company is able to kind of take over in different lands and different countries? And so there was always this tension between the East India Company and the British government and the crown. And you've heard if you've heard of Warren Hastings and his famous trial that took over like 6 years, there was allegations of corruption, and various ways in which the East India Company was often critiqued by the British themselves for being too brutal, too greedy, and just too much in a lot of ways. I wouldn't mistake that for anti-colonial sentiment, even though certain scholars do like to present it that way. But I think it was more about the image of Britain in other countries and what that said about Britain itself and this sense of like civility and rational behavior and, not caving to excess and things like that that they were more worried about. But that also, and I think something that we see often in historical romances is this sort of fascination with the East. It was a place of freedom, for people who felt like they were penned in by social norms. Um, you have rules about who you can marry and how you behave and who you talk to and who you don't talk to and what kind of, ways you comport yourself. That all is taken away when you are, in these mysterious foreign countries where there are no rules, seemingly, for you at least. And so I think there is an intersection with the fantasy of the historical romance, or in romance in general, and the Orientalist fantasy that was perpetuated as a way to justify imperial presence. And I think we walk a fine line when we're writing about it and reading about it. And so I think it's something that I'm not saying it's wrong, but you have to be very careful about how that is presented and explored in the novels and in the books, I think. And as we have seen, there are obviously authors and writers who do that better than others. um, and something that I find really interesting, and my research is really focused in this late 18th, early 19th century period, which was sort of a transitional period, is that the East India Company on some level understood that in order to make any kind of headway in India, they had to learn the language. They had to learn the lay of the land. They had to get to know the natives and their customs and their religions and their rituals. And so a lot of them spoke the local languages. A lot of them learned Sanskrit. William Jones is a famous Sanskrit scholar who was the first person to translate the Bhagavad Gita, which is like the Hindu, one of the famous Hindu sort of religious texts into English. And so along with this study of India and its rituals and everything that became it, a lot of people became quite Indianized. They were wearing Indian clothes and living like Indians. A lot of them had families in India. And this made people back home in England very nervous, because you are coming into too much contact with the foreign entity. And to sort of add insult to injury, a lot of folks who were not from the aristocracy would go to India, trade, work for the East India Company, make their money, and become sort of absurdly rich and be able to come back to England and compete with the aristocracy, which was often losing its money. And so suddenly you have these traders aghast. Like we see so much of derision towards trading classes in our romance novels, women wanting to marry traders and their parents being scandalized about that and, things like that. But that's because that was quite real. This derision towards this trading, this rising trade and middle class that was able to compete with the aristocracy, but they didn't consider of the same class, was truly sort of something that actually existed. And I'm going to skip ahead to this last point on my slide here, which is that because of this sort of notion of the trade and middle class being shunned, scholars have posited that the idea of the East and West binary, or the us and them binary, really was something that had to be manufactured to justify imperialism, because Britain was a hot mess at this time. They're recovering from revolutions, American, French, Haitian, multiple revolutions. They're having political crises upon crises. The East India Company is doing all kinds of shenanigans over there, and they're, going on trial for that. And there was this sense of there was a class war and there was a gender war that intersected with the kind of imperial, racial, and ethnic wars that were happening. And scholars have noted that the same language that was used to put down Black and Brown folks was also used to put down the labor classes and the working classes, often using sometimes the same racial epithets to insult them. So there is a sense that the lines dividing various groups of people weren't as sort of clear as we imagine them to be now. That sort of happened later. And so I think it's important when we are reading novels, particularly ones that are set in the Regency, because you can get really distracted by the glitz and the glamour of the period, that there was this simmering world of tensions in various different ways. I'm only talking about race and empire here, but I'm not even getting into the ways gender and empire was intersecting, because women were frequently used as this symbol of British purity to sort of re-corral the sort of to re-corral the East India Company officer who has been seduced by the Eastern woman and her lavish riches or whatever, like on stage, that was a really common trope. And so when we're thinking about the historical romance heroine, those are kind of questions we can ask. And then to really quickly finish up what I'm talking about, the East India Company was dissolved in the 1850s, 1857 to be exact, after the Great Mutiny in India, and the Sepoy Mutiny. And after that, the British Crown took over. This is the era of Queen Victoria. And, she was famously gave herself the moniker, the Empress of India. And now, instead of being under a private company, the colonies were under the British Crown and the British government. This is when the empire became far more organized. Everything was sort of categorized. Administratively, they were kind of really at the top of their game. And Edward Said goes into this in his book, but he talks about how this sort of rigid categorization was also a colonial tactic. You put people into their little boxes and then you stack them up. This is why a lot of former colonies have a lot of ethnic problems right now and civil wars, largely stemming from that era of categorization. This was when things like education and religion was becoming more and more standardized. A lot of the missionary schools in South Asia came into being around the 1850s and after. English language was implemented as a field of study. Um, Thomas Macaulay famously said in a minute that he gave to the English Parliament in 1850 something, that teaching the locals English would make them, quote, pliable colonial subjects. So this was the start of sort of this cultural conversion that accompanied the actual military and political invasion into a lot of these countries. So there's a lot more I could say, but I am going to stop now so that we can talk a little bit more about the books and open it up maybe to questions or anything else people want to talk about. Thanks for your patience, everyone.
Oh, that's a phenomenal just context, because I think that, and we talk about this especially with Regency romances, how much has been stripped out of those settings in our stories for a very, very long time. And it is helpful, I think, as modern readers to understand how depoliticized in the attempt by early authors of the Regency period to make that period look, when, to your point, all of this was happening, and you can't entirely strip it. Like, we see these products in our romances, we see these performers, we see these theater references, like, even despite their best efforts to make it feel like this little fairy tale bubble of, just rich white folks going to balls and having a grand time, like, you can't pull it out because of just how intertwined all of these issues are and how present those tensions are. And I think it's really fascinating to understand I mean, I think even helpful for me as I trace some of the books I've read across Regency, Victorian, etc., the transition between the East India Company, the British Crown, like this is just incredibly helpful context for a lot of the books that I know our students are reading right now that I've been reading recently. So just very appreciative of your time in breaking that down.
I've been making a list of books that I would include in like a wrap up for this lecture. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, write that down before.
Yep.
I won't lie, I need that myself too, because I remember there was a period when I avoided books that were trying to talk about, you get these romances where people are in India or in Sri Lanka or in in Egypt or whatever, and they were, to put it politely, very problematic. And there was a good chunk of time, and I think there's such a wealth of romances being written, I would say, in the last decade or so, that are trying to grapple with this complexity of the presence of the British Empire in really interesting ways. And like, there's so many different ways to do it. And I think what I'm most excited to see and keep seeing is how different authors, particularly people who are well versed in the period or who have lived experience studying and being from those countries, bring to and give us ways to think about the empire in new ways because we're talking about it in romance. I think that's also really, really important.
Oh yeah. And the evolution in direct engagement. To your point, from I mean, we can all think of a book we've read that was just deeply Orientalist,
Yep.
exotified. I mean, just immediately three to four come to mind where it's
Yeah.
like, yes,
I
textbook.
mean, desert romance was a like an actual genre that existed, like the innocent white woman who's given her like sexual awakening by some Arab sheik in a harem or something, and then like that was a whole genre that existed. And those covers, oh boy.
Oh yeah. And then I think of even that period of romance where they felt like they were challenging that by trying to show like these are like good British people too. I mean, it's just wild to
I
see
think,
that.
yeah, as you say that, it's like Mr. Impossible is like
Oh,
the
totally.
neon sign. Like I always think about how in that book they're in Egypt and they're like walking past half buried artifacts of a bygone era and you're like, "Oh, that sounds so interesting. What is that?" And you Google it and it's like at the British Museum. And it's like,
Huh?
"Why?"
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, for sure.
Well, I can't wait to talk about because I know now today we do have authors who are doing that kind of direct confrontation, but also coming from very different backgrounds and experiences than a lot of our kind of early white women writing historical romance, and coming with a very different perspective and trying to more directly engage in different ways and through different kinds of characters. And I know one that all three of us love. We did The Marquess Makes His Move by Diana Quincy as a summer camp read because Emily and I love that book so much. And I'm so happy you enjoyed it, Shavi, because this book is just so special to us.
Listen,
Would love to
you
talk
give
about
me a broody like hero with like a mission, and I am there.
Also, it's so silly.
he's undercover and he's so committed to like it's so altruistic. Yeah. He's
Have
Yeah.
you, Shavi, have you read the other books in this series?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
I read actually I went kind of backwards. I read the second one like last year and I
Yeah,
then
yeah.
did one three just, like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, because I just kept thinking
Well,
about the travelogues as you were speaking earlier. And I was like, oh, I
yeah.
wonder if she's read Her Night with the Duke.
Well, that's what I love so much about what Diana Quincy is doing in this series, and this is the only three books of hers that I have read. But what I loved is that she took, especially in one and three, she took these jobs and these products that were almost violently colonial, and gave them to folks with lived experience. And I'm so sorry, I'm going to forget every hero and heroine's name because I can never keep that in my brain. Um, but Leela, that was her name in the first one. There we go. Um, her writing, and I loved how she combines both the reality of women writers in the 19th century, who we know writing under a pseudonym, pretending to be a man, But also she's writing of her home. She's writing of her people. And so there's an authenticity to that that is totally absent from, you know, the actual travelogues that existed during the time. And I read a lot of those for my dissertation, and it is challenging to put it mildly. And then again, map making in the third book, I see maps as again something that was so violently colonial, like drawing lines across uh, areas of land that did not have that kind of significance of ownership to it when indigenous folks were living there, or cutting across tribal lands and creating mass chaos in the years to come. Now we have this woman of Lebanese origin trying to do that. And I love that, it makes her very real that she didn't get that from her Arab, from the Arab side of her family. She got that from the white side of her family, the British side of her family. And then she's using that as a way to counteract. And that's why I picked this quote. She's tired of doing maps of property for entitled aristocrats. I loved that. It was such a good way to reclaim that sort of tool that has been so divisive for various colonial lands, I thought.
And I love how literal this fight becomes in that book. And just, I mean, one, Diana Quincy writing Palestinian characters living in diaspora, living, in England during a
Yes.
period where, and they talk about, I feel like, especially in the first book, she's really engaging with, the Orientalism of the time and
Yes.
how people, see her travelogues and see that area, of the world. And then we see so literally him fighting for his property and the land, and a white man relining and literally stealing his land through a map, using a map as a tool of just direct colonial theft, from
Yes.
someone else.
And
Uh,
and
yeah,
and how easy it is to change the lines on the map and then, make a claim of your own for that, which is literally what happened. Like it's a microcosm of what happened in reality. And I really love that he's using this. I mean, nowadays, and I reading these books right now obviously, has a extra layer of significance and resonance at the moment, because every time he talked about his attachment to his land, I was like, oh, I had like a pang. And every time the way he was planting orange trees and olive trees and talking about that in his land, like he is in England, he is
yeah,
nobility, and we see very clearly how he feels neither here nor there, and his grandmother, pushing him to be more sort of English, and him sort of being like, I don't want to do that. And these little ways of bringing his homeland into his English land, which just, I'm like, I need to think about it more to have like something more sophisticated to say about it. But I just was it was such a touching and beautiful representation of how to make these very small and yet very powerful gestures in a historical romance that is about an aristocrat. And that's kind of what I really loved about what she was doing with this.
yeah. And to your point, it was so easy to steal in that way for white nobility at the time. And it reminded me, I read this book not long after I read Minor Detail by Adania Shibli. And that was, obviously wholly different genre, style of narrative. But there's a sequence in that that feels very like surrealist horror where the main character is driving through areas that have just been entirely remapped, and is struggling with the like trying to align the map of today with
Right.
where those villages were, in indigenous Palestine. And it is reading this after and seeing like map has been this violent colonial tool for eons, just and the ability for white folks to simply redraw, and then the gaslighting of that experience of like, you must misremember, it's always been this way. Like you see those same threads of kind of like the surrealist horror of it in this story in a much lighter context. And we have the comfort in historical romance of knowing that he'll get his due at the end, he'll have justice. We go into it with an expectation of that, which is a gift I feel like Diana Quincy is, giving her characters in this period. But yeah, it was hard not to see that parallel in reading this.
I agree. And just to remind folks too, like England wasn't just doing this in the East. They were doing this in Ireland at the same time.
Yeah.
If anyone has read or seen the fantastic play translations by Brian Friel, the whole thing is about British colonial presence in Ireland in the 19th century. He wrote it in the 20th century, but it's literally them coming and redrawing the lines, renaming places, changing the Irish names into English names, and trying to force these village schools to teach standardized English. Like it's showing how imperialism very much was not just done militarily and politically, but linguistically, and geographically. So like these, I mean, it's so multi-pronged, and it's easy to not see it if you don't know what to look for. But yeah.
And I know another mutual favorite author for all three of us, Courtney Milan, who is also
Ah, the queen.
frequently writing characters of diverse racial backgrounds, a lot of biracial characters, I mean, just fascinating. She has no imaginative limit on how she can craft a story.
And I didn't have time to reread Devil Comes Courting, but I was skimming through my highlights, and something that I appreciate so much with Courtney Milan is how she like, and I don't want to get into a conversation about Bridgerton right now. We can't, but I'll finish my point. But when we have conversations about which books are, well, I'll talk about Bridgerton a little bit. It, my contention with Bridgerton always is that in trying to make it quote unquote diverse, the books did not have the foundation built into that, right? And which is why I think they're running into certain issues with the adaptation. However, someone like Courtney Milan, and certainly a whole list of other historical romance writers who are BIPOC and who are writing from lived experience, they have built in the reality of the British Empire and the racial diversity that was present at the time into the very foundations of their story. Like it is scattered. It's not like a isolated scene here and there. It is everywhere. It is in every scene. It's in by the way comments. It's in side characters. It's in their declarations to each other, which is what gets me real swoony. And I love the Pursuit of, which is such a short little novella, but just so well done, I think, because to me, I think the biggest takeaway, aside from how cheese can fully be a side character in any story, for those of you who have not read it, like, I'm so sorry, you just need to read it. If you know, you know. Um, but the conversations that these two characters are having with each other, and a white character and a black character, who, and we have our very sunshine white character who thinks that his acceptance of this man is enough, like that's enough, for a relationship, for a friendship, for, whatever it is that they want to have. Like it's all copacetic because I'm cool with you. And I love this moment that, John turns around and is just like, no, just because you think it's okay, that does not mean it's okay. You're not questioning where all your privileges are coming from, that it has come from the deaths and the backbreaking labor of my people. You're not thinking about where this stuff is coming from. You don't need to. So all your words are really hollow. And it's such a short little, moment, but it's so powerful. And equally then to watch Latham say like, okay, you're right. I didn't get it. That's the romance for me, like that's the way I think these books that do incorporate these issues become so romantic to me, is in the understanding and the acknowledgement that there was a problem and I didn't see it. Now that you pointed it out, I can. And that's our fantasy, right? Like with romances, like, and historical romances, that's the reality we wished happened to everybody. But oh my God, I love this book so much. It's so swoony.
And she does such a nice job. It's such a creative way to challenge like early American patriotism and myth making too, because we have a British soldier who is has memorized the Declaration of Independence. He's like the worst British soldier on the planet. And he's like carrying around these words that, and just the satire of that and the like, because we fight this today, right? Like as, Emily and I living in the US and hearing the mythology of, the 1776. And so Courtney Milan is taking like such a unique little inroad to like give this British character this like hyper fixation with the Declaration of Independence, and then having our Black Revolutionary War,
Right.
soldier challenging that. So it's just her ability to layer identity, to
Yeah.
create like these intersectional opportunities is just
Yeah.
unparalleled. She's so good.
And I love it because like without the scene, the romance wouldn't have worked. Like if Latham turned around and said, "What are you talking about? Like, how dare you?" and he got on the defensive, done. There is no more story.
Yeah.
And so like the way that she has made it so integral to the plot, the romance plot, is just such a work of art in my opinion. Like I adore her so much. And she does that in such an interestingly different way with this book, too. And I have to say, I am starved for more historical romances that take place that are interracial but don't involve white characters. Like we tend to think of interracial as a white character and a non-white character, but this is a beautiful interracial romance coming to you with two people who have experienced colonization in similar but very different ways. And I love that talking about that is part of the way they get to know each other. And he's so like adamant in his opinions, and she's like, "Oh, I don't know. She was trying," you know. Um,
Yeah.
and it's really, really beautiful. And I, again, like to my earlier point of Courtney Milan kind of embedding this kind of detail in the foundations of her world building. This quote on the left of the screen is in chapter one. Oh God, I've forgotten his name. Anyway, it's him sort of standing there and being like, "My God, the hypocrisy of this whole enterprise." And just sort of standing there and being just casually insulted by two very uptight British women who have no idea that everything that's coming out of their mouth is appalling.
Oh yeah.
um
Is it
but yeah,
Grayson? Grayson?
yes, that's right, yes, Grayson.
Yeah. It-
Grayson and
she
Amelia.
has and it's so interesting too because she takes the characters who are, humorous and lighthearted, because I think of our female main character as being in some ways a sunshine character, and
She
then
is
gives
very much.
so much emotional depth and like the trauma that that character has to work through her. I mean, I hate calling it an adoption narrative, knowing just how that story evolves. But it's heart-wrenching, and to see, and I think to your point, it is even more moving, compelling, and nuanced because we don't have a white character in this romance. This
Right.
is two people who can at least bring to the table their marginalized experiences, their understanding of being, subjected by the British Empire and working within and against that construct, which I think creates a more conducive space to actually confronting the reality of the female main character's story,
I
which is a
agree.
hard one.
And it doesn't involve one person teaching the other person or having to do the labor of, making them aware of what is happening. Like they're able to say, I mean, to a certain degree, Grayson has to, enlighten Amelia. Or I don't think it's enlighten. I think she is willfully, for good reason, sort of not wanting to think about the reality of what's happening. But she is forced to confront that because of him, and therefore is able to reconnect with this part of her family that has been stolen from her, because of that realization. So like again, it's so in like integral to the love story. And like that's what I just like. I mean, I just remember sending my best friend just like screaming texts about this, because I was just so moved by how it was constructed. It's not trimming, like it's not trimming for Courtney Milan. It's very much embedded and part of the world that she's building. And just
Yeah.
really quickly to the point of adoption that you were bringing, it occurs to me like of course, adoption was a dime a dozen across the British Empire, and certainly there were no, ethical standards of practice around it as we see. But this notion of transracial adoption that is a modern topic that we talk about today, like there's a lot of documentaries, of articles, stories about the realities of being a transracial adoptee and how, particularly when you are with a white family, how traumatizing that can be. And I love how Courtney Milan takes some of those talking points that are circulating in our conversations today and just so seamlessly makes it fit into a 19th century narrative. That's not easy, and a lot of people try to do it and don't do it well. But, she is so good at taking things that we recognize from our world, even though, she's not even using the term transracial at all, because that's a
Yeah.
modern term. But we recognize it for what it is. And like I am so in awe of her ability to bridge the sort of gap of time and space in her books to make us think more deeply about these issues, both historically and in the present. It's
Oh
just
yeah.
remarkable.
Yeah, because it makes you, I mean, it makes you confront the conversation happening today and thinking about just the deep roots in that, that this is not a new conversation. This is hundreds of years in the making of doing exactly this, in other countries. And yeah, it
Yeah.
can't recommend The Devil Comes Courting highly enough. And then she just casually was like, I'd also like to write a story where they're laying, telegraphic line, across the Pacific Ocean and creating a telegraphic code for Chinese characters to translate, for use in other countries. And there isn't one, so I'll just make one because that's
Yeah.
what we want to, like just
Wild.
making
Wild.
her own telegraphic code for Chinese characters.
And the idea that she's setting this, so yes, we have characters who are quote unquote Western, at least Grayson is, and then Amelia is Westernized, which is a whole separate situation. But the story does not take place in the West at all. Like, nor is it, as you said, Chinese characters. These are it's out of kind of everyone's comfort zone, I would say, like in terms of what they're used to with historical romance settings. And I just like, again, I'm just a broken record at this point, but like she is so good at being able to build these solid worlds that give commentary, are just swoony as hell, because I don't think I have read anything much like Grayson's pre-prepared responses to Amelia's letters, which are just possibly the most wildly surprising romantic thing I have read ever in a book. Um,
Oh, yeah.
is able to put all these elements we love about historical romances alongside such big topics and big feelings.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
just she's the queen. She is the queen.
She is well deserved. Well, and I
Did
loved your history on travelogues too, as you were saying that you and I'm nearing the final act. I just have had a slow reading weekend, but A Modest Independence by Mimi Matthews. Mimi Matthews being an author that I've really enjoyed reading recently. And this one has been on my TBR for so long, and people kept recommending it. And so I was like, Shavi, I'm pretty sure this is a road trip romance that we're going to have like a travel experience, in India. This would be a great read for our conversation. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts reading it. I know even just a two-thirds of the way into it, it's been a very interesting perspective on the like travelogue.
absolutely. And oh God, I have so many thoughts. Okay, first of all, I appreciate the depth of research that would have gone into writing this. And for folks who don't know, A Modest Independence by Mimi Matthews is two working class characters from London who are going off on a road trip to India to search for a missing friend slash employer slash brother of a friend. They're searching for an earl, essentially, who supposedly died in the famous mutiny, Sepoy Mutiny of 1857 that I was referring to earlier. And somehow Jenny, the female main character, doesn't quite believe that he's dead, but she also wants an excuse to go on an adventure. And Tom, who is helplessly and hopelessly smitten with her, makes up all kinds of excuses to accompany her. And what I loved about this was it, and it's always so interesting to read a romance that is by a, author who has lived experience,
Mhm.
and a BIPOC author, but writing white characters who are in, this particular situation where they're venturing into, and having encounters with the other, so to speak. And I thought she did that so well because to me, Jenny and is it Tom? Wow, I
Yeah.
literally finished her
Oh
brain.
yeah.
Tom.
Finchley, Tom Finchley, yeah.
Oh, my brain. Anyway,
Okay.
but Jenny and Tom to me showcase this very interesting two sides to how how the work of the empire was viewed by different people. So to Jenny, her travels is an escape. She has the very sort of typical, slightly naive, almost I would call it, like notion of how going to see these exciting, exotic, mysterious new places will like give me an escape from the, you know, drudgery of my life. And so that to me is to a degree she is a little bit of an orientalist because she's viewing a lot of the things that she's seeing with this sense of fascination and mild objectification. She doesn't mean any of it with any bad intention at all, but nevertheless that is what's happening. Whereas Tom is a bit more of a realist, and I think his own experiences as an orphan, this scene that I've quoted here is when they're in Egypt and she's being surrounded by these beggar children who are running up to ask her for money or for sweets. And she, in the goodness of her heart, wants to give them one, and then, wants to give one person something, and then a whole swarm of kids like show up. And she is so distressed that she can't help everyone. And Tom is like, there are poor, suffering people everywhere. Don't make yourself ill over it. And I love this part. I can't just ignore them. It's too cruel. If there were children like this at home, what do you mean if? Have you never been to the East End, to St. Giles, or any of the other neighborhoods in London where people live in poverty and despair? And then she's like, oh, right, I did know that. But in her brain, she didn't think that they were one and the same. And then a few lines later, Tom's saying, we're visitors to their country, not their saviors. So I like how Mimi Matthews is, and this is what I think some of those older novels fail to do. It's fine by me to have examples of racism, exoticism, objectification, any of that. But if you don't have the challenge to it or the questioning of it, and then I'm not, a novel doesn't have to be a history book, and certainly doesn't have to be like a book on telling you how to behave. But you do have Tom here challenging her notion about that, which just gets the reader to think about it, and be like, oh, if I keep thinking of third world countries or the global south as those poor people who are constantly in states of war and poverty and hunger, blah, blah, blah. Oh, heck, like that's in my backyard too. And I love and it's continuously there in the book. I did find it interesting though that so there's a trope in literature where when you go to the place that is exotic, or somehow leave like a scene of civilization, that's where things are topsy-turvy and rules don't apply anymore. Shakespeare does this a lot, when people go to the forest from the palace and suddenly like no rules apply, everyone's falling in love with everybody. And that's sort of where you come to big realizations about yourself. Your existential crises are solved. And I find it interesting that Jenny has so many of these realizations when she's, quote unquote, in the land of the other. And whether that's her feelings for Tom or her feelings about her own insecurities, or how she's framing the world because of her experiences, whatever it is, there's lots of different things. But I did find that interesting. I have to think a little bit more about it. But that was something that I think set this book apart from anything else that I have read before. So I'm eager to see more from Mimi Matthews and how she tackles that in potentially other books.
It's really interesting too, because I think reading this is a reminder to me that it's also, and you said this earlier so well, like this is a really hard line or a difficult line in romance, in novelization when we're in fiction. And even with your best intentions, it's hard to pull off, right? Because we're bringing two white characters into the like, and yeah, like there are tropes that you play into sometimes, whether they're intentional or not, it's still a power dynamic that exists on page. And so I think this is a really interesting one to think of too, because so Ahmad and Mira, who are side characters in this, come back in her next series in the first book, The Siren of Sussex. Ahmad is the main character. And it's so interesting to me, having already read Ahmad's book and now going back and reading him as a side character and seeing like, oh wow, like you can see her like starting down this path of writing characters, uh, you know, with backgrounds more similar to her own and also facing, more diverse kind of intersectional issues. And she's
Right.
getting there, but she's not there yet. And then you see it when you get a Mod story, like her kind of stepping into this place more intentionally. So it's really interesting to see the different approaches to this kind of story for an author, and just a tremendous amount of respect to her for doing that, because there's a lot of vulnerability in writing, even in her author's note for this book, trying to
Yeah.
envision a period of time where her own, I think, I can't remember one of, if it's her maternal or paternal, grandparents, but, thinking of what they experienced, and under colonial rule and what that must be like. And that's a challenging and vulnerable position to write from. And so it's really interesting to see her growth and kind of steps into this conversation where we see Courtney Milan much later in her career and doing, you know, because I also have read backwards through Courtney Milan's backlist, and
Right.
to
Right.
see where, she's just like guns ablazing and like Devil Comes Courting. She's like, I'm gonna tackle everything. We're gonna talk about all of it. We're gonna do everything that I've ever wanted to do, in a story. And her early Harlequins are very different. So it's very interesting to see that too.
And I was skimming through Diana Quincy's earlier books too, and a lot of them, I believe, don't include Arab heroines or heroes, I think. So, it is really interesting. And I think that speaks so much to the landscape of romance readers now, because I mean, we're starved for books like this that not just show us the presence of BIPOC characters, but also really tackle the material realities of their existence during these times and in these lands and in these various environments. And I will say, like, there is so much joy in just reading books like, so Sri Savita, Royaleen Singh have both written novellas where there is no explicit mention of the empire. They're just Indian characters who are like hanging out and having a good time and falling in love and having shenanigans and all the usual things we love in historical romances. And there's not a word about how they got there, why they're there, like what happened. And there is, like, on some level, a real joy in that. And if I can, if I'm bringing in Bridgerton to this is where I think that adaptation went wrong, because I think had they not tried to provide an explanation for how and why there were BIPOC characters in British aristocracy, I think the series would have, at least for me, succeeded a lot more. I keep tripping up on the fact that they're like, oh, the king and queen fell in love and therefore racism is solved, essentially. And you don't need to do that. There was no need to do that, because there were Black and brown aristocrats, very few of them, but they did exist. Either because they were mixed race children of aristocrats, but there were a couple here and there who were granted maybe not titles as high as dukes and earls, but there were barons and smaller titles that they did hold. It's not totally out of the realm of possibility that one of them, maybe for the sake of a story, could have been a duke or a viscount or whatever. And so I think what people like Sri Savita and Royland Singh, and I'm sure there are more I haven't read, where people just exist in their blackness, in their brownness, without having to explain why or having any trauma because of it, or having to sort of always have this like racial narrative around it. Those are also really imperative. And I like that we have a choice of those. We need both because we need all of them to exist in our landscape. And I just hope we see more and more authors and up and coming authors do really cool and exciting things with this. Like, I think we're in a good time for this kind of story. And I'm just manifesting more and more books for us like this.
Yeah, I think of recently we had an opportunity to talk to Sherry Thomas, and one thing that she said that she shared very casually, but really has stuck with me, as she talked about My Beautiful Enemy, which is her historical romance that does, center a Chinese character. And it's her, and it, as we went around on this Zoom and we're all sharing our favorite of her books, so many people said My Beautiful Enemy. It was, a shared favorite among us. And she was like, wow, I never hear that. That's my poorest performing book, and I think it was published too early. Now people are more excited to read those stories, but at the time I
Mhm.
published it, it was a bit of a dud. And I keep thinking about that because it's a reminder that, the power that we have as readers to support authors when they begin writing more vulnerably and more, imperatively within, that kind of intersection of identity with their stories. And we guide that, like with the books that we read and recommend, we make it possible for authors like Diana Quincy and Sherry Thomas and Courtney Milan to write these characters by reading them and recommending them. And it breaks my heart that there was a too soon time for some of these books
Mhm.
because of us, because of the market for reading them.
I think particularly for anybody who's watching this discussion who is a bookstagrammer, it's a good reminder that the content that you create for your book account is effectively free marketing for publishers and authors. So it behooves us all to consider who we wish to provide that kind of like free advertising to, and whose stories we're hoping to uplift in that way. Because like immediately I have like a roster of like 3 to 5 authors that come to my mind who I'm like, yeah, it's fun to show off that you like also read these books that are really, really popular, but like they're good. Like they have the
Time.
marketing budget, the publishers throw their weight behind them. They're in the New York Times all the time. Who like where is the My Beautiful Enemy of your like list of books that you've read that you loved so much, but the author would say, "Oh, that book didn't do that well." And you're like, "What? I need everybody I know to read this amazing book." Like, I don't know. I get more gratification from shining a spotlight on those books, I think.
Hmm.
And My
I
Beautiful
have to
Enemy is
say,
awesome.
um, a a shortcoming on my part for this conversation today is that there aren't no queer books on this list, largely because I haven't been able to buy or afford to buy some of the ones that do exist. But there is room for more. There aren't as many queer historical romances that feature characters of color in them, or BIPOC characters in them. There are a few. There certainly exist. But there certainly, I mean, if we're like trying to rank in numbers how they exist, they're kind of right at the bottom. And the only one I can, for some reason, that I can think of is KJ Charles, which is a wonderful book, but she's not a BIPOC writer. And I do like her books very much. But we do need to see like a lot more queer and trans characters who are also BIPOC characters. And I sympathize with authors because sometimes even in the landscape of today, sometimes these books will come and flop. I have heard authors say that when they have BIPOC characters on their covers, sales plummet. Which is wild to me because you would have read this if it had the white partner on the cover, but not the black or brown partner. Like, okay. But anyway, I mean, we're getting into other tangents that will take another hour for me to talk about. But like, I fully agree. And to Emily's point about bookstagrammers and what we can do, I will also say, as a brown bookstagrammer in what is a fairly white landscape of Bookstagram, it is always delightful when I see other folks talking about these books and also talking about what they learned from it, because I know sometimes there are readers who will, take only the romance and discard whatever else has been talked about, whether it's about empire or, any other issue. It's partly why I started the Reading is Resistance challenge last year and earlier this year as well, because I want people to actively think about how do you feel when you read a book like Devil Comes Courting and it is maybe upsetting what you're expecting to see in a historical romance, but not really, because it has all the tropes you love, it has the romance that you love, it has the grand gestures and all the beats that we love in a historical romance, but it's not set in your typical ballroom. It's not people taking carriage rides through Hyde Park. It's a very different setting with people whose problems are very different from that of the white characters. How did that make you feel? What did you learn from that? And I love it when I see reviews of people who are actually talking about that and drawing attention to those parts of the books as well, because authors put that in there in their in genre. And I have to say, like, the romance genre, like many other genres, has its roots in and can have its roots in kind of colonial and oriental settings. So how do you disrupt that in your writing, and how do we as readers disrupt that when we try to talk about it? um I had another thought, but it ran away from me.
In this moment, while you maybe get that thought back, I'm realizing we're an hour and 10 minutes in, and I haven't given a code word for our extra credit seekers. So let me just really quickly say that in honor of the pursuit of, which we're all going to read if we haven't read yet, you need to DM at Romancelandia Uni the word cheese to get your extra credit this week. And again, you can claim this extra credit at any point during the fall session. As long as the fall session is going on, you can watch this video and you can DM cheese. All right. Anyway, that's that little bit of business done.
This has been just an incredibly broad conversation, Shavi, and your amount of research and just bringing in your day-to-day study. I know that this feels like a drop in the bucket of what you think about and research day to day, but it is so helpful for us individually, but also all of our readers. We hear it's so cool to see the book reports that come in for Romancelandia University and seeing how people are building their syllabi and seeing how people are making really intentional decisions to diversify their historical romance reading and really trying to find more of these intersectional characters. And so this is just a tremendous foundation for them and thinking about these periods and how empire and race build out these stories and these characters in ways that are sometimes on page and sometimes not, but there regardless.
It's always
Whether
there.
or not it's directly confronted, it's there.
No, this is hugely such a joyful thing for me to do, because, like, I mean, not to get too personal, but like, to me, being on Bookstagram is what like takes away the pressure of grad work. And this is the period I love. I mean, I got into this because I am obsessed with the 19th century. It's nuts. Everyone's a mess. Everyone's like super horny and messy, and like it's wild. It's the perfect period to study. And coming into thinking about race and empire came later to me as a result of my own colonial conditioning. I grew up in a colonial based education that taught me to appreciate British poetry and British literature. It was much later that I was like, why do I like that so much? And so it is, and this is a genre that I love because of my love of the 19th century. And so to talk about empire and race within historical romance, to watch the strides that are being made in the genre is really just all my favorite things colliding in one. And so, and as an academic who is very much about, because we know academic institutions are also colonial inventions, and my job always is trying to push back against that and to have these types of conversations where we're taking romance seriously as a genre that can both shape the way we think about the world and is also shaped by what we are experiencing and thinking in the world, to me is pushing back against the notion that romance is just a silly chick lit kind of genre. Like, these do so much work aside from just the money that it's making, but they just do so much work. And so I'm really grateful to both of you for like having a place like this where discussions like this can happen and people can have like a fun reason to create these lists for themselves and read more of these books. So kudos to both of you and everyone who's been participating. I wish I had like the discipline to stick to a reading challenge and participate, but I don't.
Girl, you can
But
do
I
your
do
dissertation.
reading stuff.
You don't have to do play school with us while you're doing real school. Don't worry, don't put that on yourself.
You've given us quite
But,
enough time.
but yeah, I know we're super over time, but does anyone have questions?
I mean, this
Holy
this presentation that you've made is going to slide really neatly into like a wrap-up post that we can do together in the next couple of weeks. And this is just like so beautifully done. And we're so grateful for how much time and energy you've given to this. I really learned a lot in this lecture. I feel like I was just like quiet. I was like, school is in session. So thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. And if anyone does have questions, like feel free to just DM me. Like I love nothing more than to talk about this stuff. So like DM me, like I is that my handle in the chat? I'm tagged in stuff. You'll find me. I'm around. So feel free. Yeah, thanks guys.
All right. Thank you, Shavi.